so much for coming out on a cold evening for our third Thursday. I did hand out our programming for the spring, so I know you've gotten a chance to take a look. The museum is open until 9 p.m., and after Brian's talk, he'll be up in the Howard Finster exhibition to answer any questions as you get to see the works of art. Please take a look as you go into the Taubman after the talk. Our galleries are open on the second floor. Our third floor balcony is also open this evening, although it's quite chilly outside. And we also have Paint Your Pet going on. So take a look at our artists that are painting their pet in the auditorium this evening. Tinks at the Taubman is to your left when you enter the museum. And on the second floor, the retail space is open. There's 40% off on our holiday items and some great gifts. We have the Roanoke star ornament and different things to take a look at as well. So our programming coming up, there's a lot of adult classes, programs for families. Tomorrow night is Dickens, so if you're up to coming out to downtown again, there's lots of things going on outside. The roads are closed in terms of the downtown area, so you can take a brisk walk. But the museum is open again tomorrow evening till 9 p.m. And we have the Roanoke Valley Children's Choir that will be singing and filling the auditorium and atrium and the whole museum as their sound covers with, continues with a sing-along. And that starts at 7 o'clock. So there'll be over 200 children here from the ages of 7 to 17 singing. So it's a wonderful musical extravaganza tomorrow evening as well. So come back out, enjoy, and thank you for coming this evening. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Amy Moorfield, our Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Collections.
Thank you, Cindy. Good evening. How's everyone tonight? Thank you very much for bearing some chilly weather. On behalf of the Taubman Museum of Art and my exhibition co-curator and speaker tonight, Brian Sieveking, our deepest thanks for coming out and to help us celebrate Happy Birthday, Howard, the amazing world of the Reverend Howard Finster. We are celebrating his 100th year anniversary as a prolific artist, a poet, a preacher, a musician, and a visionary who described himself as a man of vision, a second Noah, and God's garbage man. The exhibition is comprehensive and includes over 111 objects, as well as a video produced by Will Solari using archival footage from collectors Anne and William Oppenheimer. The exhibition is open till 9 p.m. tonight, so afterwards, if you're so inclined, please to go up in the galleries and take a peek. We want to take a moment and thank, sincerest thanks and appreciation to Walter and Sally Rugaber for their support of the exhibition. And of course, deepest appreciation to the lenders of the exhibition, and there's several: Ray Cass, Anne and William Oppenheimer, Thomas Scanlon, Chris Gillenwater, and a private collection. We also have several works from our own permanent collection on view. And we thank you, all the lenders here with us tonight, for sharing your special treasures with us and our community. And finally, a deep note of gratitude to Brian Sieveking, my co-curator, who was passionate spirit for all things Finster, and I'm kind of underselling that here, Brian, enabled this exhibition to happen. And now an introduction to Brian Sieveking. He's a painter, an educator, and a print publisher who lives and works in Roanoke. As part of the Mountain Lake Workshop from the mid-1980s to 1994, he worked closely with Howard Finster on projects including documentaries, Workouts, the Virginia Film Festival, and a series of unique serigraph prints published in Roanoke and held in the collections of, among others, the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Taubman. As a folk art collector, curator, and scholar, he studied, written extensively, and worked closely with artists such as Finster, Georgia Blizzard, Mose Tolliver, and James Harold Jennings, among others, and worked for such institutions as the National Museum of American Art, to the Folk Art Society of America, and of course the Taubman Museum of Art. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Sieveking.
It always takes me a minute to get used to talking into a microphone, so bear with me on that. First of all, thank you for coming. When I saw the temperature, I thought that I was going to be beaten by the Paint Your Pet portrait night out in the auditorium, and I'm really glad that I outdrew them. So I'm going to talk for a little while about Howard tonight and then take questions if you've got lots of questions. When they first said you need to do a half-hour talk about Howard, all these ideas bounced around in my head. My biggest fear was that, it would turn into Brian talks about himself with occasional mentions of Howard Finster. And I was very worried about that. And then Mike Allen, who writes for the newspaper, kind of came to my rescue by sending me an email that just said, who is Howard Finster and why is the Taubman doing a show about him? And it sort of struck me for a minute as being really kind of curt, but then I actually really liked it because it raised a lot of issues about Howard and how Howard's reputation has kind of developed over the last really 35 to 40 years. And I also liked the fact that it was in the present tense because Howard's career is something that's been in constant change and metamorphosis, really, I would say for the last 88 years, but certainly for the last 40 years. So the more I thought about it, the more I also liked it because Howard really spent a lot of his life asking the question, who is Howard Finster? And an awful lot of his art, first as a preacher in his sermons, then as a musician in his music, then as a poet in his poetry, and finally as a painter. The idea of who Howard Finster is was something that he sort of changed and modified and adapted and developed over the course of his entire lifetime. In fact, there's a very good argument to be made that Howard is one of the premier performance artists of the 20th century. He sort of invented himself in a really kind of amazing and uniquely American way. Now, Howard's story is really pretty straightforward. It's very strange and it's very unusual, but Howard was someone who always moved in a straightforward manner, very quickly and with great passion, and let nothing get in his way. So just as a little sort of basic introduction to Howard and who he was, I mean, he's sort of the classic American success story in some ways, and then an utterly bizarre, turnoff on the classic American success story at the same time. Howard was born into rural poverty in the southern Appalachian Mountains in Valley Head, Alabama in 1916. He was one of 13 children. He sort of went back and forth between whether he was the 9th or 10th of those 13 children, but he was one of 13 children. He went to school through the 6th grade, and then his parents asked him to leave school because they wanted him to work on the farm, or he was asked to leave school because he probably was dyslexic. And if you were in public schools in rural northwestern Alabama in the early 1920s, they didn't have a lot of sympathy for people who were dyslexic. So essentially, they told him he was stupid and told him to leave. So Howard worked on the family farm and began having visions at a very early age. And we'll talk a little bit about the visions later on, but they were part of his life really from about the age of 4. Now, he received the call to preach when he was 12 and actually started preaching when he was 14. And by the time he was 16, he was actually involved in circuit rider evangelical preaching on a pretty wide scale. And he spent about 30 to 40 years of his life as a preacher. Generally, he would work with between 2 and 3 churches, and then he would do a tent revival every month. And he did this while he was supporting his family as a bicycle repairman and working in textile mills and creating little, what he called souvenir art, which was dollhouse furniture and little cannons. There's some in the exhibition upstairs, and decorative wooden frames that he sold, that were sold on the streets of Tryon, Georgia, and Rome, Georgia, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then also at tourist attractions like Ruby Falls and Rock City, which were close to Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. But Howard's most important sort of formative profession as he grew into adulthood was preaching. And the role of preaching in Howard's art is pretty obvious when you look at the paintings and read the amount of text in the paintings and read what the text in the paintings say. But it also played an extremely important role in his development as a performer and in his development later on as a writer and as a musician and particularly as a sculptor and a painter. Howard officially was a Baptist minister. He was Primitive Baptist. But Howard moved back and forth and sort of moved around and across multiple Protestant religious groups in northern Alabama and northern Georgia and southern Tennessee for really most of his life. He talks about the fact that he actually received the call to preach in a Methodist church. And then he received his second call to preach in a Pentecostal tent revival. In Howard's world, the most exotic church, at least in his early life, was probably the Catholic Church. But Howard really made no differentiation between different Christian groups. And in fact, in his life later on as a painter, he would always proclaim that he believed in all religions. He saw religion as a living thing, and he saw religion as a series of revelations and reformations, and really a way of recycling himself and everyone else. He actually had a very large worldview. And I'll talk a little bit later on, the people who tried to say he was a Buddhist and tried to say he was a shaman and tried to say he was various other religions are pushing it a little too far. But Howard, while an evangelical minister, differed very, very greatly from what we think of in 21st century America as sort of evangelical, evangelicism as it's sort of descended to us from Lynchburg. So, So Howard did lots and lots of things. He did numerous river baptisms. He was involved heavily across all of these churches. We went on a trip with him once where he took us to about 14 different churches in Alabama and Georgia that he had helped to build. And one of his continuing themes as we went from church to church to church was he was kind of upset that they were all now either a Baptist church or a Methodist church or a Pentecostal church, because when he initially helped to build them, they were all just open meeting spaces that could be used by really virtually any group that wanted to get together and have a revival meeting or have a Bible reading or have a discussion even. So this sort of crossing over and openness to different ideas was very much part of Howard's life. And I also think it's important to stress that when Howard started preaching, quite often he was preaching with people who didn't preach from standardized Bibles. Howard actually first became interested in his religious calling before the Bible had been officially standardized and printed and distributed in the form that we now know it. And an awful lot of the older preachers that he learned from and talked to were preaching from Bibles that had been printed in the 19th century. And so Howard was really familiar with the Apocrypha. Howard was really familiar with a lot of very esoteric teaching. He also knew everybody from the Catholics to the Presbyterians to the Methodists to the Baptists to the Pentecostals to Church of God, and paid attention to the differences and paid attention to the similarities and was constantly sort of trying to work back and forth across all of these ideas and all of these approaches. So Howard preached really professionally and really as his main profession for about 35 or 40 years. to take care of his family, he worked as many as 22 different jobs. He would talk about the fact that every now and then he would make enough money at a tent revival to sort of survive for a month, but that at the churches he preached at, people really didn't put enough money in the collection plate for someone to make a living. So here's a picture of Howard and Pauline, his wife, who really is one of the great hero of this story, because I think Pauline, living with Howard was probably not the easiest thing in the world, and 4 of their 5 children. This is Howard. This will just give you an idea of who Howard was for most of his life. This is Howard right after the textile mills in North Georgia and northern Alabama told him that he was no longer welcome to work in any of the textile mills in northern Georgia and northern Alabama because he had been pushing for a 10-hour day and people getting off on Sunday. So essentially, Howard was blackballed and went back, and that little building they're standing in front of, and you see it in the inset in the upper left-hand corner, Howard built that. And he didn't only build it, he developed the bricks that are in it, those cement blocks. He sort of dug all of these patterns in the backyard of the house they were renting, and then poured all the cement and colored all the cement, and then built the building, and then wired the building, and then tiled the building, and then stocked the lower floor of the building with grocery products because he wanted them to run a little grocery. And he did this while he was preaching at 2 different churches and running tent revivals and repairing bicycles and building furniture and teaching himself how to repair television sets. That sort of energy, that sort of unbelievable dynamic living of life would typify Howard really well into his 80s. So Howard preached, he repaired television sets, he built bicycles, he repaired bicycles, he built radios and repaired radios. And when he was in 1961, he finally decided that he was going to follow a vision that had come down to him, and more about those visions later on. He said that he had a vision that he was supposed to build a garden that would celebrate both the Garden of Eden and the inventions of mankind, which seems like sort of an odd pairing, but it really does. One of the things about Howard is, if you look back to the inception of Protestantism right after Martin Luther, an awful lot of Protestant theology gets tied up in the idea of technology being a symbol of God's grace and being, a manifestation of God's will on earth. And Howard was still very much a believer in that and an exponent of that for most of his life. So essentially, he was teaching at a Baptist church in Rome with 2 other preachers, both of whom were seminary graduates, both of whom were probably a little bit annoyed with Howard because Howard had a tendency to do these very, very long, very, very surreal, occasionally bizarre sermons in which he would explain and illustrate his visions. Really, they were very much like Dante's Inferno. I have one on tape called Howard Finster Walks Through Hell, which is an hour of Howard talking about going to hell in a vision and all of the people he meets in hell and all of the things he sees in hell. And, he runs into various people. He runs into a rock star who assures him that Elvis is not in hell because Elvis recorded gospel albums. And he meets Hitler. My favorite part is he runs into Hitler and just looks at him and says, "Hitler, you're a fool," and then explains to him why he was a fool. But when Howard had the vision to build this garden, initially he wanted to build it around the church in Rome, Georgia. And these 2 other ministers who were actually probably a little tired of Howard, but also not very happy with the fact that Howard was drawing the attention of professors at the University of Georgia. And these professors at the University of Georgia were coming to his sermons and recording them and putting out albums of his sermons and recording songs that he had written. And more of these kind of intellectuals and professors and kind of strange people from down the road, were coming in from Athens and sort of filling the church. And so when Howard suggested that he build this around the church, they suggested that he retire. So Howard went to Pennville, Georgia, which is outside of Summerville, Georgia, and bought 4 acres of swampland. 4 acres of swampland that was across the street from the state penitentiary. And began to, at the age of, this is 1960, so in his mid-50s, began to irrigate it and drain all the water out of it, and began to remove all of the foliage, and then began to remove all the snakes. There's photos of Howard pushing wheelbarrows full of snakes out of the swamp. And I guess he took them across the street and dumped them on the grounds of the penitentiary. And then he set forth building his magnum opus, which was originally called the Plant Farm Museum, and sort of developed from, in front of that blockhouse that I showed you earlier, Howard built this little Bible land that was full of little mansions and churches and buildings from the Bible. And then there was also a museum in there in which he displayed various odd artifacts that he had collected. And one of the foundational things in Howard's life was when he was a circuit rider evangelist. And he just went on road trips all over Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee. And while he was very, very dedicated to these revival meetings, he was also fascinated by all the cities they visited, all the advertising in the cities they visited. He also was really, really interested in carnivals and in sort of roadside museums and roadside attractions. He also read anything he could get his hands on, from old Bibles to new Bibles to religious tracts to religious handouts, but also popular mechanics and also science books. And he was fascinated by advertising, movie posters, Burma shave signs, and all of this sort of flowed together in his head and really began to come out when he started building the Plant Farm Museum, which after about 2 years he decided to name Paradise Garden. Paradise Garden was what first really drew the attention of the nation to Howard. It was a very difficult sort of creation from its inception. When Howard first started building it, the locals were not particularly happy that this weird guy, who really wasn't from Somerville itself, he was from Tryon, which is like 12 miles away, and from Rome, which is like 20 miles away. When Howard started working on this, people were nice enough to come by and dump all their trash in his yard. And at night, when he was in there working on this, people would drive by and take pot shots and just shoot out of their cars into the garden. But slowly over time, he began to build this sort of amazing world of poured concrete sculpture, mosaics, inlays, paintings, constructions, buildings built out of mirrors, out of bottles, out of Bible verses. At one time, it was completely covered with overhanging, ferns and flowers. He also filled the garden with reflective material and with material that was meant to make noises when it blew in the wind or when people walked by it. It really is a very sophisticated sort of multimedia piece of installation art. And it's one of the first pieces that Howard made that in some weird way ties him to late 20th century American art. Howard was an installation artist. Howard was a multimedia artist. Howard was, in a very real way, a pop artist, but coming from an entire different direction than the artists who are in your art history book. In 1976, Howard had what he would describe as his fourth great vision. While he was repairing bicycles, he was painting a bicycle, and in the paint on the finger of his hand, a face appeared and told him to paint sacred art. I can do it I tell the story just like Howard told it. If you want me to later on, I won't right now. And that face looked at him and said, "Start painting sacred art." And after he argued for a little while and said he couldn't paint, and how could he paint sacred art, and then the face convinced him that he could in fact paint sacred art, he set out to paint 5,000 paintings. That was the goal that he set for himself. He was going to paint 5,000 pieces of sacred art to try to answer this calling. Now earlier, about 2 years earlier than he received this call, people had started coming to the garden. First, there was a writer from Esquire magazine, and the writer from Esquire magazine wrote a lengthy article that made Life magazine send a photographer down to photograph Paradise Gardens, to photograph his installation piece, his environmental piece. Howard sort of picked up on that and started going. And when he started painting the paintings, he used those as a stepping stone to national attention, almost by sheer will. I mean, there's no easy way to explain how a largely uneducated evangelical preacher in, let's face it, the middle of nowhere in Georgia manages to, within 5 years, place himself in the Library of Congress is a great mystery. But he did manage to put himself in the Library of Congress. He did manage to put himself in the Corcoran. He did manage to get himself on the Johnny Carson show. Eventually, he managed to end up in the Venice Biennale as one of the 12 American artists in the Venice Biennale, really just because he decided to, and really just through sheer force of will. And Howard in the early 80s is a really, really interesting figure because he sort of reached this enviable place as an artist. I mean, he was being shown in folk art galleries, but he was also being shown in very hip, very hot galleries in Chicago and in New York. He was being written about, he was on TV, and really 1985 is a watershed year in Howard's career. By 1985, he was very well known. He was this strange sort of character in Northwest Georgia who had created this sort of personal, vocabulary that involved wild animals and historical figures and biblical figures and pop cultural figures and sermons in paint and landscapes and homemade frames and this continual recreation of visions that he had and ideas that he had. He sort of switched entirely from sermonizing at churches to sermonizing in paint. And his paintings very much were the continuation of his ministry for his entire life. But by 1985, I think this picture is from the Washington Post. There was sort of a continuing group of acolytes who came to talk with him. He had developed a sort of cult following among musicians in Athens, Georgia, and among academics, particularly at the University of Georgia and at Wake Forest. He had started doing workouts where he would come to a college with his dimensions, his giant stencils, and work with the students. He'd gone to the University of Colorado, he'd gone to VCU, he'd gone to Virginia Tech, which is where I met him. And he was really starting to be seen in the art world as this bridge between traditional and modern folk art. There was a very big battle going on in the folk art community between people who sort of wanted to deal with traditional folk art, whether it was caning or painting or broom making or pottery, and very definitely wanted to continue this sort of study of older traditions. And then a whole new group of people who were interested in these sort of funky people called outsider artists or contemporary folk artists or visionary artists. And there were really some pretty ugly debates going on. And Howard sort of stood as this figure who had one foot in each camp. I mean, he had all of these sort of attributes of traditional church painting and, evangelical broadsheet painting. The words that he used in his work had this long-standing tradition in Protestant theology. But then he was also painting Elvis Presley and painting Herbert Hoover and painting spaceships and dinosaurs interacting on landscapes. And so he sort of bridged these two groups. More importantly, in '85, he started bridging this huge chasm between the folk art world and the visionary art world and what was then known as the serious New York art world. There were a whole group of artists in New York who were very interested in Howard. People, from Francisco Clemente to Keith Haring to Basquiat, a whole lot of people were really interested in Howard. And Howard was sort of seen as maybe this person who was going to be able to sort of bridge that gap between the high art world and what you were still allowed to call the low art world. He was seen as this figure who was going to be a bridge between a lot of different, sort of ideas and theories that were bouncing around on college campuses and in whatever passes for art think tanks. In 1985, Howard was written about by Art Forum, and he was written about in Art in America. And this painting appeared in the New York Times art section, their weekend art section. And all three of them were articles that really were taking Howard seriously and that really dealt with Howard as an artist. And it was sort of the beginning of what was going to be Howard's critical appraisal. Now, the people who wrote about him in Art Forum and in the New York Times were pretty uncomfortable. And these were mainly people who had spent the preceding decades writing about minimalism, writing about conceptualism, writing about sort of the evolution of the New York school. And Howard was not minimalist and was not part of the New York school and worked with a conceptualism that was pretty alien to Soho and the Upper West Side. But these people were writing about him. They were uncomfortable articles, and they were sort of, we aren't really sure we should be writing about this articles, and most of them sort of came up, with this description of Howard as being an artist who had manufactured himself, and Howard as an example of art as a method for a person to really become a personality and really form themselves into something greater than what they had been born into, which is something you probably couldn't write about now, but at that time it seemed like a good idea. What's most interesting about this piece is it was printed right next to a Jean-Michel Basquiat, and the articles between the two of them made all kinds of connections between Basquiat and Howard. So Howard really was on the verge of entering the high art discussion. In fact, I have been told by more than one person that Howard was actually visited by the people who were putting together the Whitney Biennial, and that Howard was going to be in the Whitney Biennial. And then something happened. Howard got really, really, really famous. Like, Howard got famous in a way that artists aren't supposed to get famous, and that artists rarely get famous. Howard became sort of a pop cultural superstar, and really it was all part of kind of a perfect storm. I mean, Howard's fame came about largely because of the release of that Talking Heads album. That's their Little Creatures album. And it came out and created an uproar. It was their most popular album, and Howard's painting was voted best album cover in Rolling Stone when people still read Rolling Stone and read about music. And the group on the right, R.E.M., which had been this sort of unknown band in Athens, Georgia, and two of their members, most prominently Michael Stipe, had actually lived in Howard's garden. They sort of went to Pennville, went to Paradise Gardens, and set up camp there. Michael Stipe sort of, on some level, learned how to be deep and learned how to be strange at the feet of Howard Finster. Howard had a huge following in the Athens music scene just as the Athens music scene exploded. He also was in Georgia when cable television exploded to dozens and dozens and dozens of stations, none of which had any content to broadcast. And because of Ted Turner and because of, frankly, lax labor laws, Georgia was the center of a lot of cable television in the mid-'80s. And when they needed a human interest piece, when they needed a funky story, when they needed, okay, how can we fill 5 minutes here? There was no better go-to place than Paradise Gardens and Howard. MTV, which at this time was still a major cultural force, which is impossible to think of now, but was actually true, in the late 80s, was in love with Howard. I was in Paradise Gardens 3 times when the MTV party bus showed up, and they got off the bus with their cameras and their mics. The first time, they walked up to me and they said, do you think Howard's going to have any problem talking on camera? And I was just like, just turn the camera on. Howard will have a problem not talking on camera, okay? Like, just make sure you've got 3 or 4 hours worth of tape in that camera. And all of this sort of interest in Howard combined with Howard's lifetime of preparing for this, all of his time as a preacher, all of his time in the tent shows, all of his time working with people as a television repairman, his time trying to get people to demand rights in the textile mills, all sort of coalesced in the mid to late 1980s. Howard was a master at dealing with people. He was a master at talking. Howard became the symbol of the outsider art movement largely because it was a movement composed of people who had real difficulty speaking, if they could speak at all, and had real problems initially with people showing up with cameras. Howard had no problem with any of that. Howard had sort of raised himself to be a star. And I don't say that with any kind of cynicism. I don't say that suggesting that Howard had any kind of guile in all this. He really didn't. Howard just loved being on camera. And Howard saw MTV as part of his ministry. He saw CNN as part of his ministry. So this incredible fame that came to him was really great for his family, at least initially. For his ministry, Howard, saw it as the most wonderful thing that had ever happened. But as far as people treating him seriously as an artist, as far as the continuation of this critical appraisal that had started, it pretty much killed it for a while. Howard went from being somebody who was in Art Forum and Art in America to being someone who was in People magazine. And while that helped tremendously in the sale of, the cutout angels and the little miniature Howards and the Elvises, it didn't get him into the Whitney Biennale, the Whitney Biennial. Okay, the sort of serious art attention that was being paid to him sort of backed off a little bit. And that's one of the things that made me really interested in Mike Allen's questions. Both the first one, who is Howard Finster? Because who Howard Finster is as an artist is something that's still very much evolving. But also the why should you do a show about Howard Finster? And the show that's upstairs is one of several that's going on now and planned in the next couple of years that were specifically designed to help people to start looking at Howard as an artist again. Howard sort of got critical reappraisal before he got any critical appraisal. And some of that critical reappraisal was wonderful, and some of it was really nasty. Okay. After Howard became famous, there was a definite divide that hadn't been there before between the art and the celebrity. And the celebrity led to really, I think, some oversimplification of Howard's work and some overpraise of Howard's work and also some overcriticism of Howard's work. But above all else, it led to a real misunderstanding of Howard's work. And just sort of in order, there were people who sort of started demonizing Howard. And what's interesting is that really started in the outsider art community. We have an outsider art book at Virginia Western that I unfortunately made the library buy, that very early in the book, this doctor, who shall remain nameless, goes on a tirade about how Howard is just a sociopath and insane, and if he, had ever been talked to by any kind of psychiatrist who had the ability, he would be in a mental institution. What's most interesting about that is 3 chapters later, the same author writes an entire chapter on artists who are in prisons and mental institutions, and they come into vastly less vitriol than Howard does. Okay, so there was this sort of slapback. There was this idea that Howard had sort of gotten a little above his place, that Howard was receiving a little too much attention, that he'd gotten to a place where he really wasn't supposed to be. And some of that is still around. It's disappeared a little bit. Maybe more damaging is this sort of romanticization of Howard that took place at the same time. And it's a problem that's happened more and more in the contemporary folk art and the visionary art community, particularly as budgets of museums and things have started to be slashed, is there's a tendency to start looking at the cute stuff and the pretty stuff and the nice stuff, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, Howard was interested in making beautiful pictures on a lot of levels, and Howard was interested in delighting people. That's absolutely true with a lot of his paintings, but these paintings aren't meant to be cute, and they don't come from a place of false nostalgia. This picture is in the exhibition. It's the only picture I'm showing you, I think, that's in the exhibition upstairs. This is a picture of Howard's homestead. This is, do I have a pointer on here? No. This is Howard right here as a baby. Now, this is the kind of painting that a lot of times people will ask me, what's real folk art and what's not real folk art, and what's good and what's not good. And I have a lot of trouble answering that a lot of the time, but really, like all art, it comes down to intention and sincerity and vision on the artist's part. And most real folk art and most good folk art doesn't come from a place of false nostalgia. And it doesn't come from some kind of ersatz, wasn't everything great in 1917? If you look at this picture, 17 people lived in that house. And if you start looking at Howard's siblings, this is his sister, who about 2 years after this picture was taken, was bitten by this dog when it got rabies and died. This is his, where is he? This is his brother, who's in one of the boxes upstairs that was made at Virginia Tech. He was run over by a truck. This sister died of tuberculosis. And this is his older brother, who was with Howard when he received the call to preach. And for over a year, Howard refused to do that and felt embarrassed about it and wouldn't do it and felt that he couldn't do it. And that brother, who he described as someone who had been burnt on the back of his neck badly when he was a child, so he grew up physically but didn't grow up mentally, was with Howard when he received his second call to preach. They were outside. And a year later, that brother was raking leaves with Howard when lightning struck close to him and he was burnt up in the resulting fire. And while Howard didn't talk about this much, Howard always felt on some level that that happened because he had refused his initial call to preach. So this work doesn't come from a place of cuteness. And it is really serious work that comes from a difficult place and a constant struggle within Howard, but also a very sincere and very, consistent place. People also have a tendency to concentrate on the multiples that Howard made, They'll talk about how he cranked out cutouts and how he made hundreds and thousands of angels and thousands and thousands of little Howards. And that's true, but that was just a small part of Howard's output. Howard was capable of creating very abstract things. He was a graphic master in a lot of ways. He was incredibly imaginative. He worked across every possible media that was presented to him. He would experiment with marbleization. He worked with found objects. He worked with recycled objects. He also did straightforward paintings. I have to admit, when I initially pulled the slides, I have a tendency to move towards the scarier Howard paintings, but most of Howard's paintings were actually dealt with heaven and actually dealt with his idea that he was sort of the last Noah, that he was God's last red light. And he truly believed sort of the tradition that he grew up in. Preachers tended to fall into one of two categories. They were either hellfire and brimstone preachers, or, and this doesn't get nearly enough attention paid to it in movies and pop culture, they were heaven on earth preachers. And Howard definitely believed that it was possible for heaven to arise on earth if, as he constantly said, people just started treating each other better and behaving right. This is the World Folk Art Church in Paradise Gardens. When Howard got there, it was a shed. He sort of built this by himself, by hand, turned it into a 5-story wedding cake that was filled with art and covered with, objects that reflected light in interesting ways and made interesting noises. And then he filled the church itself with his paintings, other artist paintings, interesting objects that he had found, sculptures that he created, some of the inventions of mankind that would have been destroyed if they'd been out in the garden. And in the direct center was his perpetual motion machine, which he never got to work, but he did work on quite a bit. He was, on some levels, a straightforward religious artist, and on some levels, a straightforward pop artist. And we don't have the time to have a big discussion about pop art and religious art and how they maybe dovetail in a way that, makes some people uncomfortable and other people really happy. But Howard did have this sort of vocabulary of characters and images that he constantly returned to. It's another shot of Paradise Gardens, which was constantly changing as people bought things, as he repainted things, as he broke things and rebuilt things. There's another Paradise Garden picture with a train that he built out of chicken wire, and a painting of Abraham Lincoln, and a little image of himself down in the corner, and John F. Kennedy's down there too. This is a very, very small part of what was a 4-acre installation. And at various times, all of it was this dense. All of it was this full. All of it was this colorful. He made carved paintings. He made art out of really anything that was available to him. These are the trash cans from Paradise Gardens. Some of the trash cans from Paradise Gardens. He did historical paintings. This is Henry Ford at 2, and Henry Ford driving his Model A across the bottom. More religious paintings. Howard's hell paintings. Howard could do hellfire and brimstone if he wanted to, but there's always a little bit of humor in it. I mean, his devil did come from Underwood Devil Ham. Here's Shakespeare. Howard was very interested in books, very interested in magazines. He constantly read. And he was admiring of the great figures from human history as he saw them. And he would not paint certain people. He had a whole group of people that he would paint, whole categories of people he would paint, and then other people he wouldn't paint. I tried for years to get him to paint Ty Cobb. I thought that was a real natural for him since Ty Cobb was from Georgia, and my unhealthy obsession with Ty Cobb is well documented. And Howard would just look at me and he would say, Ty Cobb, the Georgia peach. And I go, all right, he's going to do it. And then he'd go, I think athletes get enough attention. And he never stopped making sermons in paint. Some of them are immensely complicated and covered with words. Howard was very definitely a word artist and a text artist. Another shot of Paradise Gardens. And yes, that building to the right is entirely made out of hubcaps, and the building behind it is entirely made out of bicycle parts. And it was 2 stories high, and you could walk around inside of it. Howard also loved the fact that the sculpture to our left that has the snakes all over it, it's called Serpents in the Wilderness. He absolutely loved it when real snakes would come up out of the swamp in the garden and lay on top of it to sun themselves. This painting's about a little over 6 feet high. In 1986, Howard painted his 5,000th painting, sort of fulfilling his goal to paint 5,000 pieces of sacred art. Between 1986 and his death in 2001, he painted 42,000 other paintings. And those are the ones that he numbered. If you want a good estimate of how many pieces of art Howard made between 1961 and 2001, that 40-year period, it's probably somewhere in the 70,000 range. He worked constantly. In the Johnny Carson interview, which is upstairs, he talks about working in the garden by day and working in his studio by night. And that's not an exaggeration. As a 21-year-old, I would sit in his studio chugging Mountain Dew, trying to keep up with this 70-year-old man who at 3 o'clock in the morning was working on paintings and watching TV and talking through a sermon and having a conversation and eating coffee out of a jar. And yeah, I said eating coffee, not drinking coffee. He was interested in experimentation. He was interested in automatic writing, which he sort of made it analogous to speaking in tongues. He was interested in art history. This is a peaceable kingdom. Slightly different animals than appear in Edward Hicks' Peaceable Kingdoms, but the same basic idea, the same basic biblical quotations. And he was very much aware of Edward Hicks. He was very much aware. He looked through art history books constantly. If you look at the giant angel that's in the show upstairs that has the lists of all the people that he knew on it, there's whole sections that are just names out of art history books. And sometimes he was capable of doing things that he sort of, with a wink and a nod, would give you an idea that maybe he knew a whole lot more than you thought he did. This is called Santa Claus and His Three Sons. And it sort of combines contemporary people with mythological figures with spaceships. The best example upstairs is the dinosaur with John Hancock and the spaceship in the background. And I really loved those because I thought they were really funky and I thought they were really cool and I thought they were really neat. And then one night I was talking with Howard about it, and Howard said, well, I was reading about the 3 ages in the Bible, and I had no conception of what he was talking about at the time. But every now and then Howard would drop these theological concepts that were pretty advanced. This is another building from Paradise Gardens. This is a nice self-portrait of Howard. This is about 5 feet high. Howard in the heaven box. And then we'll end with this picture of Howard here and why we did the show upstairs. Howard is still very much a figure that in the early 20th century, as the art world and even larger worlds struggle with ideas of inclusion and ideas of marginalization and ideas of trying to cross cultural barriers. Just as he was in 1985, Howard is still one of the artists who can be a key in all that. Howard was an artist with one foot in very traditional, very pre-war, regionalized America, and then had one foot in cable television and professional wrestling and computers, and also, whether by accident or not, managed in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s to sort of deal with an awful lot of artistic ideas and artistic movements that were all the rage in New York City. And the reason you do a show like the one upstairs, and the one that's currently up in London, and the one that's currently up in Georgia, and the one that's currently up in New York, is to sort of start to reappraise Howard and start to look at him as an artist and not just as sort of this wacky guy, you know, in the South. Which, it's perfectly okay to look at him that way too, because he was. But he was something much larger than that as well, and actually can stand as something even more important in the future. So if you've got questions, I can ask questions, or if you want to go up and look at the art, you can go up and look at the art. Yep.
Did he meet with any other creators, like the Watchtower, the Coral Castle in Florida, any other eccentrics like that, who really created from their own possession?
Well, when Howard first started being famous in like the late 70s and the early 80s, he was invited to that sort of groundbreaking folk art show at the Corcoran. So he met Mose Tolliver, he met Jimmy Lee Sudduth, he looked at a lot of art by people like Bill Traylor at that point. He also, you know, just as sort of his place as a spokesperson, met people like Eddie Owens Martin. Most of the people that he met were in Alabama and Georgia, maybe Mississippi. And Howard also set himself up as a clearinghouse for that art. Howard would trade a piece of art with any artist who wanted to leave a piece of art in the garden. And he would put that art up on the walls of the folk art church or of his studio and put the person's name and address and put the person's phone number on there. And he laid out all of the books that were sent to him by people writing on folk art. He laid all those out for people to look at. Phyllis Kind always said that Howard had a great eye for his art, but didn't have any eye for anybody else's art. And so there was a wide variety and a wide discrepancy of quality. But Howard really was a champion of anybody else who wanted to be an artist. But the other folk artists who he met, and he didn't carry on lengthy correspondences with them or anything, but they were almost all in Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee. The garden, there are people now trying to rebuild it, and it's sort of an interesting debate that's going on right now. Howard, I think, in his life accepted the fact that the garden was going to sink back into the ground. Like, I think that towards the end of his life, he was sort of comfortable with that. I mean, when you build something on a swamp, unless you're the Disney Corporation and have enough money to build Disney World, eventually what you build is going to sink back into the swamp. And when you went to visit Howard, the first time that Ray and I went down there, Howard, we were in the World Folk Art Church, and the breaker in the World Folk Art Church had been thrown, so there was no electricity. And Howard went down the stairs. Before he did, he put on rubber boots because there was 1.5 feet of water in the basement that he was going into to mess around with the fuse box and get the electricity turned on again. So when he realized that none of his grandchildren were going to keep the garden up, he sold many of the pieces in the garden. I mean, Thomas Scanlon, you know, bought numerous pieces of the garden and has taken really good care of them. And he lent the Coke bottle and the mailbox and things that are upstairs. He sold a lot of pieces that eventually ended up in the High Museum. But about, I'm going to say 7 years ago now, people in Somerville finally decided that maybe the garden was something worth preserving and worth putting back together. And over the last decade, they've been raising money to do that. They've made some headway in it. They have some of it rebuilt, some of it, sort of recreated. I think it's still sort of up in the air whether that's going to be successful or not. But there is an ongoing attempt to sort of rebuild it and turn it back into what it was. They did rebuild Eddie Owens Martin's environment in Georgia. The state of Georgia helped rebuild that. This one, the town of Somerville is trying to do, and the Paradise Garden Foundation. But it's a job. Rebuilding something that's sunk into a swamp is not easy. Yep.
Is he a genius?
I think he was. I don't think there's any question of that. And was he a genius? Not just, I'm not going to go into any kind of argument or anything about looking at the paintings and saying, clearly he's Michelangelo, but just in the degree of things that he built. Like, I'm a big believer that genius is measured by problem-solving ability and by creativity. Howard taught himself how to build television sets. Howard, he said that he had mastered 22 trades, and when you first hear that, you kind of go, yeah, sure, but every time I do another show and look at things, I'm introduced to another aspect of him. I went down to Thomas Scanlon's collection. He has, I'd seen the frames that he built and the little dollhouse furniture that he built. Thomas Scanlon has large pieces of furniture made out of oak and marble that are just exquisite that Howard was building in the 1950s. The number of trades he managed to master, and I think he did manage to master them, the amount of art that he created, the consistent openness to ideas that manifested itself throughout his life, even to the very end of his life. I think, yeah, I would describe him as a genius. Yep. There's a follow-up.
Do you think that in any way he was a self-promoter?
He was absolutely a self-promoter, but not. This is my story about Howard and self-promotion. Howard was a master of that. We took him to the Virginia Film Festival in 1992 because they used one of our prints without our permission as the poster for the Virginia Film Festival in 1992. And it ended up being this really wonderful adventure. But Howard, one of the things they did when they called up and started saying, we can do this and this and this and this and this and this if you don't sue us, was they gave Howard a show at the McGuffey Center in Charlottesville. And Howard showed up. I went down to pick him up because he didn't want to fly. And he, of course, immediately came out and filled this Lincoln Continental with artwork to sell in Charlottesville because it had been a slow day and slow month in Georgia. So he put about 100 pieces in this car. And we went up and set this show up. And it was really interesting because they thought they had about 50 seats set up. And I was going to talk, and Ray was going to talk, and then Howard was going to talk. About 1,200 people showed up. More people showed up for Howard than showed up for Sidney Poitier or Robert Duvall, and this was at the height of Howard being Howard, but it was also 2 years after Lonesome Dove was made. And Howard sort of just took over and talked for about an hour, and then they asked him if he could sign posters for them. And Howard came up to me, and he saw this huge stack of posters, and he saw all these people in line, and he walked up to me and he said, how long do we have before we have to leave? Because he knew we had to go to this event. And I told him, and he said, okay. He said, I'm going to sign as many of these as I can. And he said, 20 minutes before we absolutely have to leave, come up and put your hand on my right shoulder and tell me we have to leave. And he said, now, I don't want you to get upset about this, and I don't want you to feel bad, he said, but I'm going to say, no. I can't do that. I've got to stay here. I've got to do this. These are my fans. And he said, I don't want you to feel bad. He said, but you're a college-educated man in a suit, and it's going to be really good for them to see someone with a 6th grade education talk to you that way. I was like, okay. And then he said, 10 minutes before we have to go, come up and put your hand on my right shoulder and tell me again we have to leave, and I'm going to do the same thing. And then he said, 5 minutes before we have to leave, put your hand on my left shoulder. And he said, and that way people won't be disappointed when we have to go. And I mean, Howard, he learned about performance, and he learned about audience, and he learned about, how to work a room very early in his life, and he knew how to do it. But I can honestly say that his self-promotion was all about his ministry, and his self-promotion was all about getting the word out. And I once sat in Howard's studio while a representative from a fairly notable New York gallery came down and talked to him. And if I'm not wearing a suit and not talking, I fit in really well in rural North Georgia. I think they thought I was one of his kids. And this person sat down and gave him a very long discussion of his career and how if he just went with them and stopped making these little cutouts and stopped making all this art, if he would concentrate on larger pieces. They had a flow chart printed out. They had a very slick presentation about how they were going to bring the prices of his paintings up to $100,000 a piece. And they gave a very nice presentation, and Howard was very polite, and the second the guy finished talking, Howard looked at him and said, but then only rich people will have my paintings. So yeah, he was a consummate self-promoter, but I honestly believe without guile, without sort of, bad intentions.
Who is the largest collector of Howard?
I think Thomas Scanlon is the largest collection of Howard. Yeah, there's sort of an argument between him and the Arients in Chicago and a couple of other people around and about. But when I went to visit his collection, I was knocked out. I mean, he not only has paintings and sculptures and major pieces, but he collected all of Howard's idea cards, his vision cards. He has the marrying book and the bearing book that's in the show, where Howard had all of the approaches that could be taken at a funeral or a marriage. I mean, he has an astonishing collection.
When you describe him as secret education and dyslexic, how much did he read later on, either theology or the Bible? He pretty much stick with just the Bible and simple things.
Well, he always said that everything he needed to know was in the Bible, and a lot of people say that. But he also read lots of other things. Now, I don't think he was, he wasn't Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting where they're, running their hands across. I think he always read slowly and deliberately. But he loved popular mechanics. He read, when people would send him magazines with articles about him in them, he would read all the other articles in the magazine. He read the newspaper. I don't think he read a lot of novels or, but he read constantly. He also had the television set on 24 hours a day and moved back and forth between documentaries and news shows and religious shows and wrestling. Yep.
If he read so much, why was his writing so incorrect? I guess I thought he was illiterate.
Well, he definitely was not illiterate. And like I said, he was constantly looking at things and he read, but, I think that he still had some of, the learning disabilities. And the writing is really interesting because part of the writing is he wrote stream of conscious and wrote, these aren't paintings that, he had in his studio for 6 months. And, he would do a painting every night. And one of the things that's really interesting about his writing is when he was at Tech the first time, he would do this when he was in his studio too. He would ask how to spell things. If he didn't think he was spelling something correctly, he would ask you, how do you spell this? And some people would tell him, and then other people would say things like, oh, we love the way you spell things, or, and he always took that as real condescension, because it was. Like, he wasn't very happy when people would say that. But I think it's a combination of, that early experience and lack of education that he received as a child, and also just the speed with which he worked. And, there are writers who will say things like, spelling is, I think if you look at manuscripts by a lot of famous writers, there's a lot of misspellings and bad spellings in there. But I also think Howard played with it. I think it was part of that sort of improvisation that he started doing when he was a preacher. Because one of the things that kept coming up when we were putting the show together was, how do you spell cheetah? Because there's like 5 pieces up there that have cheetahs in them, because Howard loved the cheetah. He loved that shape. Howard, in many ways, was a real formalist too, because once he found a shape that he loved, he would use it over and over and over again and sort of explore it. But I think he spelled cheetah the way he wanted to spell cheetah on any given night. Sometimes it's C-H-E-A-T-A, sometimes it's C-H-E-E-T-A, sometimes it's C-H-E-E-T-A-H. So he would spell the same word 4 or 5 different ways. And I also think some of it might have to do with the fact that he, early on, he looked at so many of those books from the 19th century before spelling had been completely standardized. And it just wasn't something that he found important. What?
Did he sleep?
He slept about 3 hours a night. And that was when he was in his 70s. He would, he lived on, when we first met him, was when he was in his late 60s. He pretty much lived on coffee, Tang, and quite often the coffee and the Tang were eaten. They weren't, mixed up and drunk, and Little Debbie snack cakes. Pauline would make him eat something decent occasionally. Like, she would come in every so often and say, Howard, you can't live on coffee and, Little Debbie's, so eat this. But so he was constantly ingesting caffeine. But he would occasionally nap, but honestly, when I went down there a lot, I was in my 20s, and you could not keep up with Howard. He was in his 70s. He would sleep 3-4 hours.
Can you just briefly say the interaction between him and his wife and her support of his work and his
Well, I think that it's sort of unspoken, because Pauline was, very quiet and very reserved. We tried to interview her once, and after about half an hour, it was just like, this is so painful that we have to stop. Like, it may still be the only footage, I know it's some of the only footage of her, but she just, was so uncomfortable. She was, and he would talk about this, she was his rock. He met her when he was 16 years old and decided that he was going to marry her, and did, and, was still married to her in 2001 when he died. And I have no doubt that as much energy as Howard had, and as much industry as Howard had, and recognizing that Howard really was a caring parent, Pauline did most of the raising of those 5 children, and most of the running of that store that was in that blockhouse that's up there. And the first time I ever met Howard, and this was, it was like this foundational moment in my life, really. The first time we went down to Georgia was he was painting this picture of Eli Whitney on a paint can lid. And it was this really important moment in my life, because at that time I was painting these really god-awful, terrible, giant paintings about Central America and civil wars and stuff that I think I'd read an article in Rolling Stone, so I knew a whole lot about it. And they were really big and really political and really in your face. And like, lots of people who were fellow students were like, that's great, Brian. But I kind of look at it and go, yeah, I don't know about that. But I went down, and here was this painting on a paint can lid of Eli Whitney, and it was great. And I couldn't figure out why, because art was supposed to be really big and really in your face and really violent and really political. And then next to it was a painting of Eli Whitney's wife on a paint can lid. And I don't remember her name. I know that says something terrible about me. And I asked him, I said, why are you painting this? And he said, well, I was reading about Eli Whitney, and he was a great inventor and a really brilliant man, and I thought he deserved to have his picture painted. And I was like, in my head, I was like, you mean you're allowed to paint something just because you're interested in it and you think it's neat? And then he continued and he said, and then I got to thinking, his wife must have been really amazing to put up with all that stuff. And she deserved a painting too, and it should probably be bigger than his. And I realized that it was actually a painting of Howard and Pauline rather than. So yeah, they had, she lived in the garden for 39 years and put up with all the people walking through, all the people driving up in the middle of the night. And Howard was always there. If you drove up at 1 a.m, Howard was going to come out and talk to you. And finally in 2000, Pauline said, I don't want to live here anymore. I've been looking at, and Howard said, well, I understand that. And he said, why don't you and Chuck, who was their grandson, go and look for houses? And she said, well, we've already been doing that. We've been looking, we found a house. And they went into Somerville, it was about 10 miles away, and it was this really nice house for Somerville. It was, and my guess would be, I'm not an expert on property value in Northwest, but it was probably like a $150,000 house, which will buy you a lot of house in Somerville, Georgia. And it had been owned by the bank president before them. And Thomas Scanlon actually tells this story. Howard went out to look at it with her, and she showed it to him, and he was really interested. He was standing, and he was really uncomfortable in the driveway, and he sort of started rocking back and forth like he did when he was a little bit nervous. And she said, well, Howard, what do you think? And he said, well, this is a wonderful house, and I want you to have this. And he said, I'm just thinking of how many pieces it's going to take. And she's like, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, we have this much coming in, and we're paying these many bills. And Thomas Scanlon says that she looked at him and said, Howard, we can just write a check. And he said there was this moment where Howard just sort of stood in stunned amazement at the fact that they could write a check for $150,000. And Howard would always talk about the fact that when he got money, if he hadn't given it away, and he would do that a lot, which I also think probably didn't make Pauline happy, but if you were like the number of times that Howard tried to give me money when I was down in the garden, he'd say, here's some gas money, here's this, and anybody who looked like they needed money or anybody who was probably under 25, if he had money in his pocket, he was like, here. But he would give her the money, and she took care of all of that. So when I say that Pauline was really, Howard's rock, that's not any kind of exaggeration. She was a really major part of what he was able to do across his whole life.
Okay, I've got one. Okay, in 10.
You don't have to sit here if you
10
want to
words
leave.
or less.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
10 words or less.
Because I know you want to wrap this up. But I know folk art, to me, you are the folk art center of this part of the world, and you are such an expert on folk art. I mean, sorry, Ray. Oh, he's dead here. But anyway, so I'm just wondering, of all the different people that you followed, that you've collected, that you've been interested in ever since you were a young man, would you say that Howard is the person that you felt that you had the strongest relationship? And in 10 words or less, tell me if he's not, why he's not, or if he is, why he is. You get 10 minutes. 10 words.
Yeah, she was asking me about whether Howard was the folk artist that I had the strongest relationship with, and yeah. I mean, there were other people, like I loved Georgia Blizzard. Like, Georgia would be the only person in sort of the running with him. But Howard, just first of all, was like a magnet in the way he drew people to him, and this is going to be more than 10 words, so I'm sorry. But also, I mean, he was, I think for a lot of young artists in the 80s, and not just in the Southeast, I mean across the country, Howard really was this important figure who offered sort of a possibility that was new and exciting and sort of unlike anything else. I mean, the fact that this guy had managed to do what he had done under his circumstances, and he was presented, I mean, lots of teachers in the 80s taught, showed their students Howard. Ray did, up at JMU they were showing Howard. There are Howard Finster slides in the Hollins Library, because I pulled them to do talks. So, and he was really central to a lot of people who sort of started being artists in the early to mid 80s. And it's definitely true in my case.
Are you the reason why Howard was at the Art Museum of Western Virginia across the street?
Ray was the reason Howard was at the Art Museum. We did, in 1985, this is how I met him, Howard, through the Mountain Lake workshops, came and did a workout at Virginia Tech. And it was this major moment, and it's still the only one of Howard's workouts. He did them at Lehigh, he did them at the University of Colorado, he did them at VCU, he did them at a number of schools, but the one at Tech is the only one that was sort of saved and preserved, and it's in the Taubman's collection. So that's how I met Howard. That was 85, and then a student named Paul Staples and I put them all in those boxes, and then they did a big show of the things that Howard made at Mountain Lake and the things that the students made at Mountain Lake and various other pieces by Howard. I don't remember whether it was the Art Museum of Western Virginia yet or whether it was still the Roanoke Museum of Fine Arts. It was right at that moment where it was going back and forth. But that's why he was here. Yep.
What's the top price you've heard anything that was sold for recently?
Recently, I know,
Broke 50,000 yet?
yes, most of his work goes, like, I could tell you this, the last 5 pieces that have shown up at Slotin auctions in Atlanta that I looked at in the book and went, well, maybe I'll take a shot at this, and maybe because the estimate on it is only $5,000, and it says it's scratched, so maybe they've all gone in the mid to upper 20s, and they're smaller pieces. I think the most that he sold a painting for while he was alive, or the most that the most he ever sold a painting for while he was alive was $20,000. And he called it the $20,000 piece. And it was like 8 feet long and 4 feet high, and it probably took him a month or probably 2 months to make. And he didn't get the whole $40,000 because it sold through a gallery. But I think the most that a painting sold for while he was alive was probably in the mid-40s. But I don't have a flow chart on that. I just see it sometimes. You could still buy a nice Finster for $1,000 if you are willing to wait and look hard. And you could still buy a really good Finster for right around $5,000. There's a huge price, assortment in his market. And part of that is because he never went with a single gallery. Like his contemporaries whose work sells for tremendous amounts of money now were all people who made a deal with one person who represented them and built their market. And I don't say that and so they're bad and Howard is wonderful, but he made a conscious decision not to do that and made a conscious decision to make as much art as he possibly could.
Let's give a hand.
Anybody?
Brian might be willing to answer any
I'll
other
go up there.
questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.